Today is really going to be a presentation because it is 1 hour long. So as I zoom through, absolutely if you do have questions, please ask them, but also know that there is some material that I'm going to be trying to get through as we move through today. So that's also a part of it, is that I want to give you as much as possible around implicit bias as I can within 1 hour. But before I start, can you raise your hand if you've been at a workshop related to implicit bias already, or have some knowledge around implicit bias, just so I have a feeling in the room? Okay, thank you so much. So we will be doing a little bit of one-on-one groundwork. Some of you who have already been in an implicit bias workshop, this will probably be some repeat information for you, but of course, new presenters, so probably you'll be able to take in something new. All right, so in terms of what Ginger said, I'm from the YWCA. This is our mission. The YWCA is dedicated to eliminating racism, empowering women, and promoting peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. So really audacious mission that we have. But the cool thing is that we, as the YWCA in Madison, get to live out our mission in the way in which we choose. And so a part of that mission is what you fall into, which is the left box, which is the race and gender equity box. And each YWCA, if you grew up maybe in a different area of Wisconsin or even in a different state, you probably had a different kind of experience with your YWCA. We actually just had somebody last week come in and say, hey, do you have a pool or a gym here? And they had brought their workout bag. We are not the YMCA, we are the YWCA, and it is very different. Our mission and our vision and how we promote equity looks very different as well. So I'm not going to go into too much detail, but we do have a housing and shelter location, which is downtown off the Capitol Square. That might be the building you're most familiar with in Madison. We house over 100 single occupancy units for women, particularly low-income women, women of color, and also women with some children in our shelter program. And then we also have job training and transportation, and that's where we have our programming where we try to support women and people of color who have been traditionally underrepresented in specific fields, and also fields that provide a sustaining family wage above $15 an hour. And so right now we have our YWeb Career Academy, which is a 16-week boot camp, which allows folks to enter into the tech and sort of design field. And then we also have Job Ride, which you might see around. It's usually black vans with some orange writing on the side, persimmon. And it's Job Ride, which is basically to get people to and from work who maybe wouldn't otherwise be able to. Also, people getting to pick up their children from daycare, drop them off at times that maybe are not typically on the bus line. And then the race and gender equity box, which is where you are living today and which is where I do all of my work. So I work in partnership with different organizations. We do a lot of presentations and workshops, just like the one I'm doing today, related to implicit bias, microaggressions, things that might show up in the workplace specifically that might impact equity and inclusion internally. So today, our flow is that this again is a presentation that will cover the business case, so kind of giving you some grounding around why racial equity, why it's important for even GHC, for our community to be thinking about. I'm going to introduce implicit bias, so it's really going to be a brief introduction. This is not going to be down and deep. If we had 4 hours, I would be able to give you as much information as possible, but unfortunately we only have 1 hour today. And then really starting to build awareness of how implicit bias impacts us at sort of our interpersonal levels, so one-on-one in relationships with one another, institutionally at GHC as an organization, and then sort of beyond structurally. So it's a lot, 1 hour. Here we go. I thought it would be good to also ground us in sort of understanding what the difference is between this idea of equity versus equality. And that we really focus on this term equity, so does GHC, right? Health equity is that term that you use. And that there is a big difference. Equality is that everyone gets the same exact thing. Equity is that we decide what people get, or we provide resources and opportunity to people based on their needs specifically. And that's really what we're shooting for. We're shooting for a society that is really fair and just and allows people to succeed based on who they are and what they need. So you can see in the image on the right there, for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam, please climb the tree, right? So not possible for an elephant to climb a tree. Also not possible sometimes for people to get the same kinds of resources depending on the situation that they're in. Some of you probably have seen this before too. This is our iceberg model of culture. So when we think about organizational culture, and this will definitely tie into implicit bias, we really think about the organization as this big iceberg. And so 1/16 of the iceberg is what lives above the surface of the water, and then there's 15/16, right, that lives below the surface. And those are sort of the meat of an organization. That's what drives the organization. That's what happens within the organization. But really, people from the outside, as they see GHC, they see the concrete level, which is the real surface level of the organization. This is what we can tangibly see. These are the people that work at GHC. These are the programming that you offer. These are the resources that you provide. This is sort of the physical space of your clinics and your administrative building. All of these things are sort of surface level. This is your website, right? These are the marketing materials that you might be putting out there. This is what we call the diversity level. Really, really important, and also not sustainable if you just focus on the tip of the iceberg, right? So as Titanic figured out, right, that they didn't know there was a lot more meat underneath the surface of the water. And so when we move through this work and work towards equity and inclusion within an organizational setting, we're really focusing more on this sort of behavioral level. And that's where a lot of that change can happen. And then also, what that means is that below the surface, if you do that work, that change will happen above the surface as well. And so that change will be more sustainable. So what we see a lot of the times is organizations moving through this change and just really slicing the tip of that iceberg. And so what happens is there's a lot of turnover. People aren't feeling included or successful. They're not given the resources that they need to be able to sustain their work within the organizational setting. And so they leave. And of course, we know turnover is very costly. So we're really focused on this behavioral level, and this is sort of how the organization operates. This is what you do day to day. These are sort of unspoken norms and rules that you might have, ways of being, ways of communicating with one another within the workplace. Do you email a lot? Do you have a lot of meetings? That's what I've heard, lots of meetings, right? I was just at another organization doing a workshop, and they said, we are an organization that has meetings upon meetings. So like when you look at somebody's calendar, they have 3 meetings scheduled at the exact same time. You have no idea if they're going to show up for which one, right? So that is not a part of my organizational culture, but that might be part of yours. But it's interesting to think about how those things shift, and that actually the behavioral level is what makes or breaks somebody's experience within the organization. And this is called the inclusion level. And so this is a lot of the work that the inclusion change team at GHC will be working on. This is a lot of the work that you as individuals and as managers can work on and think about as you move through your workday and you're working with your supervisees. This is about sort of how to create expectations and also ways of being that allow different kinds of people to be successful. And then the lowest level of the iceberg is the symbolic level, and this is the why you came to GHC to work in the first place. Maybe it is the mission, maybe it is the vision and the values, maybe it is somebody that you met along the way, maybe it was your own experience coming to GHC as a provider. Whatever it might be, this is sort of the thing that is less tangible. These are things that are less movable, and this is what we call the equity level. And so this level is really important, but also not something that we necessarily as individuals who work at GHC can change. So really today we're thinking about how do we create an inclusive behavioral level where people feel like they can bring their full selves. So what is this thing, this business case? What is the business case for diversity? And remembering diversity being that sort of top level of the iceberg. Well, there actually is no business case for diversity without equity and inclusion. So there's really no money to be made in diversifying your workforce if you're not thinking about inclusion and equity too. Diversity alone can actually be really tokenizing, particularly for diverse individuals that come into an organization, and does not automatically create the environment where you will reap the benefits of multiple perspectives. And we'll kind of talk about what I mean by that in a little bit. But really, that's again making the assumption that just bringing in the people will make the changes that you need to be a more equitable and inclusive environment. But really, diversity alone can be actually very problematic. So diversity in isolation tends to be an indicator of high turnover. So a lot of folks that we work with are kind of stuck in this diversity place of we've been recruiting these people, they're coming to work for us and then they're not staying for more than 6 months to a year. What are we doing wrong? And that's a great place to start because I think this is absolutely a very kind of common concern that a lot of organizations in Dane County have. So why is it important for you as an organization to strive for diversity, inclusion, and equity? This is what I'm talking about when I talk about the business case. So first of all, we have changing workforce and demographics in our country. It's just, that's very real. By 2045, there will be more folks of color in our country than there will be any other race. So white people will be outnumbered. 50-50 about in 2045. And so if we're not being responsive to the changing dynamics of the workforce, and this is like if you see kids in our community and the diversity of children, these of course are the people that are going to be 2045 working in the workforce. And so we got to find a way to sustain them. Otherwise, we're not going to be a workforce that is being able to develop and change at that rate in which our community is. Diverse teams also better serve their customer base, and they make more money. So there's that business case, right? Who doesn't want to make more money? You were just talking about money just now, right? Your CFO was just up here talking about kind of making gains in that area. So this is absolutely something that drives different organizations to succeed, and probably something you all as managers, when you manage your own budgets, are thinking about all the time, right? Is how do I make sure I stay within budget? How do we make sure that we have more money to be able to provide the resources we want to within the different realms that you work? So the Kellogg Foundation in 2013 came out with a study about the business case for racial equity, and basically research that has been able to sustain a more diverse workforce. So again, that sustainability is key. Have more customers, higher revenues, profits, greater market share, less absenteeism and turnover, and greater and higher level commitment to their organization, right? Who doesn't want people to work at the organization who are highly committed? So definitely there's research out there that states that this is really important. Diverse teams also make better decisions. So diverse teams focus more on facts. They process those facts more carefully, and they're more innovative. So really cool ideas can be gathered and taken advantage of when diverse teams are feeling included within an organization. Research shows that diverse groups do more than introduce new vantage points. Diverse groups outperformed homogenous groups, not just because of an influx of new ideas, but because diversity triggered more careful processing. So the idea is that there is more space and time to reflect on sort of the needs that are coming up in your community when diverse people are at the table. Though people feel more comfortable with others like themselves, and this is just kind of normal and typical in our lives, this comfort in a likeness can hamper the exchange of ideas and stifle the intellectual workout that stems from disagreements. So I don't know if you've ever been in that meeting where everyone sort of has like-minded thoughts and you're like, oh, that went really well, we made a great decision, and that's great. And there could have been another idea that didn't come out because people were so like-minded in that space. And so when there's more diversity within a space where you're making big decisions, that can really impact whether or not you're going to be able to sort of celebrate those different viewpoints and also create more opportunity for, right, that business case that we were talking about. The presence of diversity in a group creates awkwardness, and the need to diffuse this tension leads to better collaborative problem solving. So this is all based in research. So the fact that awkwardness is something that we often avoid is actually a creator of more diverse and sort of creative ideas, which is really cool to think about, is that sometimes when you're feeling uncomfortable, maybe you left a meeting being like, oh gosh, that felt weird. But in actuality, that meant that there was some new ideas that came out that maybe you hadn't thought about, and we'll talk about how that's very much based on your bias. And that actually creates more creativity within your own mind. And so you can expand and sort of get away from your own perceived assumptions about the world or ideas and move towards more creative problem solving, not only in your professional life, but also in your personal life. In diverse settings, new ideas emerge, individuals learn from one another and may discover a solution to a problem in the process, right? So that learning, that growth, that opportunity for new ideas is just, there's a lot of research out there to support that. So this came from the Vox founder. Nobody knows everything, and no group of people know everything. But a peculiar attribute of homogeneous groups is that they are unusually blind to what they don't know, right? So you don't know what you don't know. And when you're in a group that is all similar, you're really going to not know what you don't know, right? So just we'll talk about a little bit what you can do about that too as we move forward. So why do companies like your own and other companies that the YWCA works with struggle to create a diverse and inclusive workforce despite spending money on training and recruitment, right? So probably a lot of money is going into sort of who we recruit, how we recruit them, and then we get them in the door and then maybe they don't stay. That's a lot of money spent, a lot of time that many of you probably who work in the HR department are spending as well. And the answer is implicit bias. So now, what I'd like you to do is turn to the person next to you. And if you're somebody that has gone through a workshop on implicit bias, I'd like you to share what do you remember about implicit bias, what stood out to you. And for those of you who are new to this topic, what do you know or understand about implicit bias? And if nothing, that's okay too. So I'll just give you a couple of minutes to sort of turn and talk to your neighbor. I'd love to hear from maybe one person who kind of falls in each of these categories. So maybe we'll start on the bottom, if that's okay. So if this is your first experience, maybe what do you know, or also what are you curious about? Anybody wants to share? You're so talkative when you're talking to each other, and then.
I remember reading about, I can't remember if I read about it or watched a video, but it was a study, psychological study about very young children having bias that they wouldn't have learned. And I think that the theory behind it was just familiarity kept safe in a way.
Yeah.
And so you have to actively teach to not have bias.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So implicit bias is our default. Because it is comfortable, because it is what we know. That's a great example. And so a lot of what we learn and take in also infuses or sort of supports our own biases that we already have. So children specifically in the media, right? They're taking in these sort of messages and being told this is the way you're supposed to be in this situation. This is the way girls do it. This is the way boys do it, right? And so they're taking in these messages without really being able to understand or figure out maybe where the discrepancy is. Yeah. And so then as children, we grow into, right, teenagers, we do the same thing, and then we move into be adults, and sometimes we're not even impacting that until we're unfortunately impacting people's lives in a negative way. Yeah, thank you. So somebody that attended a workshop, what stood out to you at that workshop? Anybody want to share? Yeah.
I was telling them about the gentleman that was presenting was an African-American man, and he was sharing about Jesse Jackson saying the saddest moment in his life was when he was walking down a dark street and heard footsteps and turned around and found himself feeling relieved to see that it was a white man. And he's somebody who represents racial inequality and all that, and how it's just how you are framed by the messages you give.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That's a great example. Everybody hear her okay? Okay. Yeah, so we're going to dive in a little bit more. So how does this show up for you? What kind of influence do you have as an individual when it comes to bias? I'm here to tell you that you have a lot of influence, not only because you're all managers or in a leadership role of some kind, but also because we are individuals who interact with people on a daily basis, right? Just in general. We interpersonally have relationships with other people. That's just what humans do. And so if you were living in isolation, of course, you would only be impacting yourself, but that's just not the reality of the world. And I think about, like, even on the drive over, thinking about the bias that I had about certain drivers, right? And the way in which they drove, and I was thinking, again, had to retrain my mind to be like, that's not gonna be an elderly person. You're making judgments about the way this person is driving, and it ended up being not, right? A middle-aged person that clearly was lost. And I was in a rush and I didn't want to be late. So, I think about that a lot in my day-to-day interactions, is that I have to consistently retrain myself on these biases that I have that, in fact, are just part of our framework in society. So, interpersonally, or self, first, we're going to start with yourself. So if you are aware of your natural tendency towards your implicit biases, so these again, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, is that this is the way our brains are wired. We're wired to create categories and think about things that make us feel comfortable in a way that's going to support us to move through the world. And so we really have to be aware of sort of what our tendencies are to be able to sort of interrupt those and impact those. And then if we do that, then interpersonally, we're going to be aware of that, right? Just like in that moment when Jesse Jackson turned around and was like having that relief that was a white person behind him in the alley. That moment, right, was like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? Again, this is based in my own racial bias that's been trained over time into my mind, and I'm even somebody that's an advocate for racial equity. So, then we can be aware of that. Then we can stop impacting people before we do in negative ways. And then organizationally, what we're going to see is that we're going to have more or less biased healthcare, right, as an organization. So we're going to be able to move through our agency in a way that's going to be less biased in our interactions with each other. Those people are going to go out and provide better inclusive care because they're also going to be aware of their biases. You're going to be aware of your biases and how that's impacting the organization as a whole. And then, of course, structurally, it's going to lead to better health outcomes. just in general, right? So this is like, we see a trickle effect all the way up. And if we're not aware of our biases in ourselves, then interpersonally, we're going to be perpetuating biases against our coworkers, our patients, right? Or sorry, members, however, whatever term you use, our vendors, right? The people that give us money, like all of these things. And then organizationally, that's going to be perpetuated. We're not going to have a healthcare system that we're going to be proud of or that people are going to want to be members of because of the way that they're being treated when they come in the door or the way that other people within the organization are treating each other. And then structurally, we're going to have poor equity outcomes, right? Health equity outcomes. So all of this is interrelated. So today we're really going to be focusing on yourself, but also thinking about structurally, what is your role and how can you think about this throughout all the levels of influence that you have?